Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I am so delighted to be here today with author C.B. Bernard. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back, Erin. I'm a big fan of yours and of the podcast, and it's a thrill to be back.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I've got your second novel, Ordinary Bear, in my hands right now. We are going to be talking about this incredible book. But before we hop into the book, a little bit about C.B. Bernard, who is a novelist, writer, and inveterate storyteller who has moved cross country 6 times, lived in 9 states, built a boat, walked tens of thousands of miles with his dogs, and written about everything from fly fishing to wolves to maritime piracy. After spending much of his adult life in Alaska and Oregon, he can now be found on the Rhode Island coast with his feet in the ocean and his head in the clouds. C.B. Bernard, we are going to talk about this incredible novel of yours, your second novel. Please tell me about Ordinary Bear.
Second novel in less than a year. It came out just under the wire of less than a year since Small Animals, Cotton Traps, my last one, which is wild because it was, I think, 11 years between my first book and my second book, and I was 42 before I published any of them, and not for lack of trying. So it's a thrill to have two of them out so close together. Ordinary Bear it's a weird book to describe, right? It depends on where you are in the book. It can feel like wildly different books. And that was part of the challenge for me and also part of the fun. Uh, my publisher describes it as having the soul of a detective novel, but a literary brain, and underneath it's kind of all heart. And I wanted it to mimic in some ways detective fiction, right? It's got all the hallmarks of classic private eye novels, but it's not a private eye novel. And it's also, I mean, it's literary fiction, sure, but it's kind of an Odyssey novel in the sense that, like classic Odyssey novels, like Dante's Inferno, The Hobbit, The Odyssey, the protagonist is guided through these different phases of his journey by local guides. In the Inferno, right? It's the 9 circles of hell. In this book, that particular hell just happens to be the underbelly of Portland, Oregon. So our protagonist, Farley, is guided along the way by these different people he meets throughout the city. And it's got that vaguely, I mean, I don't want to oversell it as mythological because it's not, but I just wanted to kind of echo some of the hallmarks of private eye fiction, of Odyssey and mythology, and just write a book that I think people will not expect. It goes places that I think you don't know it's going to go and that you might not see coming. And that was the challenge for me. How do I write these different kinds of books in one and stitch them together without leaving a seam high enough for readers to trip over?
Yeah, and it does make a really fun experience as a reader because you sort of don't know what's going to come next, and you get this incredible cast of characters and also this strong sense of place with Portland and Alaska, and you kind of don't know how is this all going to come together, but somehow like it all gets braided together into this fantastic conclusion. And also like even with all of those characters too, that there's two main characters in the book, Farley and Lissa. And both of them are grieving the loss of relationships. And some of those are acute and some of those are more long term, which kind of gets to what you're saying about the heart. There's so much heart also in this novel. So, how did you explore this loss and what drew you to including it in the book?
Ah, well, I'm human and humans suffer loss. I think that so my last book, Small Animals, Cotton Traps, was dark, as you may remember. Somebody asked me, why write a dark book when the world is already so dark? And my answer is that sometimes we read to escape the world, sometimes we read to understand it. And I think both are valid. And I think that what my characters go through is the very real sense of loss and grief. I think we're surrounded by it, and it's just endlessly fascinating to me what it can do to people and how it can shape the course of your life, just completely change your future. And some people buckle under the weight of it, and some people respond differently and get stronger from lifting that weight. And I've always been kind of fascinated by that, I think. Uh, it's not, all fiction comes from our actual lives, but this is not me processing a particular loss. This is not, there's no one-to-one with what happened in my life. But certainly there is a lot of myself in this book, just as there is everybody I've met in my life. And I think you learn a lot about how people process grief and what it can do to you if you don't process it. And that's just endlessly fascinating to me.
Sure. And it comes up in research too, right? Many people have heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but fewer people have heard about post-traumatic growth, which is that process of how people can take trauma and use that trauma to really catapult them into growing and healing and being stronger than they were before the trauma even happened. And you see that happening in Ordinary Bear. You see how a trauma can affect Farley and how that can impact him and propel him forward in ways that he wouldn't have before the trauma.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in the book who have suffered some kind of trauma in their lives. And I think you see the scars of it reveal themselves in different ways. One of my favorite reviews of the book, somebody said, C.V. Bernard writes characters that that you'd want to follow to hell and back, which is good because that's where he sends them. And I love that. I do, in this book and in my last, I do tend to put my characters through some things. This isn't quite the Sufferfest the last one was, but I think I like to put people's hands into the fire and see what it does, see how they respond, see how it can lead to some interesting character development or, plot points. And there is a lot of that in this book. Early on in the book, it's also a very difficult book to talk about without giving spoilers, right? So early on in the book, the tone of the book changes, the location of the book changes. I drop a bomb on readers about 20 something pages in, and that totally changes the course of Farley, the protagonist's life, and it changes the course of the book entirely. And I've heard from readers about that. My hope was that people wouldn't feel. I mean, it was a misdirect, right? It was a necessary misdirect because I wanted to set one expectation for the book and then subvert that and make it a completely different kind of book. But I didn't want people to feel like I had misled them into thinking it was the wrong kind of book for those first 25 something pages. And response has been really good to it with very few exceptions. And I like to think those are the exceptions that prove the rule. But I think that kind of also mimics the way tragedy happens, right? You don't see tragedy coming and it changes things completely. So I'm subconsciously putting the reader through the same thing the characters are going through. And I did a little bit of that with Small Animals as well, which was a book about a boxer. And I think you kind of have to hit people with jabs to distract them and keep them off their feet before you hit them with the big sucker punch. And that's kind of just, it's another writing technique for me here. And I think you see that a lot in my books.
Yeah, because in Ordinary Bear, it does feel like a sucker punch at page 25. And you're right, as a reader who experienced that with the book, like that does, like you and Farley are on like totally even footing after that, like as the reader. And so you are in it recovering from that sucker punch along with everything that continues to unfold.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You asked me what the book was about, and I gave you like a very long-winded answer. The elevator pitch is, I think, one man's brutal odyssey through the quirky and dangerous underworld of Portland, Oregon, in an effort to save a child's life and redeem what's left of his own. That is what the book is about in the sense that that's the plot, but plot is just a very small part of what books are actually about. That's what happens in the book. I think what the book is actually about is a lot bigger than that. And it is trauma. It's about lots of things, like a survivor's guilt, but it's also surprisingly funny. Some reviewer said it was funnier than it had a right to be, but isn't that how life works, right? I mean,
It's
even in the
true.
midst of tragedy, we laugh. I think we use humor as a safety valve, right? Uh, I lost a very close friend a few years ago, and our close group of friends all flew in to be there for the service. And I have never laughed so much as we did that week because we were just telling the happy stories of our life together. And it was one of the saddest occasions of our lives, but we were laughing and crying throughout it. And I think that that's fair. That's how humans work. And you have to have those two parts of your personalities, those two parts of life. And I try to make my books full of both those things. And I say that not just because I don't want people to think it's just a relentlessly dark book. It's not. I think it's got a lot of humor in it, but because I think that's the way life works. And I think it's a good reminder of that
Mhm.
for
Yeah, and
me
it's
and for the characters.
yeah, and it's a portrait of that full spectrum, right? That you can have the really, really dark alongside like people surprising you in unexpected ways and taking care of you in ways that you sometimes feel like you don't deserve. And you see that with the characters in this book too. And there's actually, like, speaking of characters, I'm going to read a short little passage from, no spoilers in this, but one of the big themes of the book is homelessness. And there's a number of characters in the book that are living homeless. And so I want to read a little passage. So this is the character Farley speaking with the character Flex. And Flex says, in The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway wrote that going bankrupt happens two ways: gradually and then suddenly. Losing your home, losing everything, it's like that. I used to fish commercially out of Newport, Dungees, salmon, had my own boat, my own crew. But fishing's not what it used to be, yeah? A couple of bad hauls and you're in the hole. Some of your crew jumps to a boat that's catching fish instead of water sets. So you have to hire new guys, greenhorns, who maybe don't know what they're doing. Then a cylinder goes in the engine and you go into debt to pay for it. The next thing you know, your boat's on the hard and so are you. You've got a lifetime of experience, but no other captain will hire you because you're too old or because they don't want you to know their secret spots or both. I loved Newport, but I had to leave because it's a lot harder to be homeless in a small coastal tourist town than it is in a city. It's a lot harder to blend in when you're sleeping behind one of the few businesses in town. There's no support, no infrastructure. I hitchhiked to Portland and bounced around the shelters and missions for a while, trying to make someplace work. Slept on the streets. He looked at Farley. Did you know they call it sleeping rough in the UK? Sounds much nicer than sleeping on the streets, right? But it's the same degrading bullshit. And I just thought that that was such a beautiful summary of how you can go from just fine to just losing it all in this like really quick slippery slope that like anyone can relate to. So tell me about writing homelessness into the novel.
So kind of along the lines of what we were talking about a minute ago, this thing happens to Farley around page 25 that he doesn't see coming, and it changes his life dramatically in every imaginable way. Same thing has happened to Flex. A completely different thing, completely different ways, but there are so many ways that your life can just change like that. Homelessness is one of them. Of course, it's an issue in Portland, and I kind of wanted to write about how we see people and how we don't see people. So Farley, he's again, mild spoiler, but he's covered in physical scars. He's a giant guy. He's covered in scars. And when you see a giant guy covered in scars, you make some preconceived notions about him. You might look the other way. You might cross the other sidewalk. You're gonna think of him a certain way. Lissa, the other main character, single mother, she's struggling to make ends meet with her daughter. People look at her a certain way. She's sometimes we just don't see people that need to be seen, and the homeless very much fit into that. There's another character, Wayne, who's kind of Farley's guide through the homeless camp that he's staying in for a while, and Wayne is teaching him the ropes and the rules. And they're thinking about how many people just walk by the camp and pretend not to see them. You just turn a blind eye, and it's really easy to again form preconceived notions about these people. And some of them probably fall into whatever stereotypes you're thinking about, but a lot of them are just people on the hard, people suffering. And aren't we all doing that in our own ways? It just affects us differently. So I think I just really wanted to. It's not a book about homelessness. It's a book about a man on a mission through a city, and that's part of life in the city. And those people living in the homeless camps that Farley's passing through, they see things that he doesn't see, and that helps him get to where he's going. That's how they are able to guide him and help him accomplish this task that he sets out to accomplish. And I just thought that was kind of a fascinating world to set part of this story in, and a good. It's always a good reminder to me that everybody's got a story, and if you just take a little time to ask them about it and listen to it, you're probably going to learn you had it all wrong, what you were thinking about them. And I think there's a lot of that happening in this book.
Yeah. And it makes for a really honest portrait of Portland too. Like Portland is absolutely a character in this book, in the setting, in the worlds, and the exploration of it. And so yeah, and I know that place really was also a key part of Small Animals Caught in Traps, your first novel as well. And so tell me about writing Portland in as a character in this book.
My wife and I lived in Portland twice for about, I think, 15 years, give or take. We we loved it there. We moved out there. I had been living in Alaska, and then I moved back to New England for a very short period of time, and she and I moved out to Portland together, and we just fell in love with the city. I mean, just the people, the landscape of the Northwest, the arts, the culture. It's just a great town, and it changed a lot over our time there. We did not leave because we didn't love Portland or because we were chased out or anything like that. Life just happens. Our parents are on the East Coast, and I think we had been away from them long enough, and we wanted to be closer to family as we're all getting older, which coincidentally turned out to be fortuitous because we moved back east about 6 months before the pandemic hit, and we were closer, which was good. But even though I point out some of the flaws of Portland in this book, it's a love letter to Portland. I think it's a love letter in many ways to Portland and its people, and a piece of my heart is always going to be there, just as it is in Alaska. Part of the book is set there, and as you mentioned, Small Animals, Caught in Traps was set in Oregon. But my first book came out in 2013. It was a nonfiction book about Alaska. Place is just really important to me, as you so rightly pointed out, and I think that's because it's so important to me in my life, not just in my writing. But I think landscape, place, climate, it all affects who we are, how we act, what we do. And I think setting in a book is really informs character in a way that isn't always linear, but I think is significant. And that true of all the characters in this book. Place affects them dramatically, from Farley and what happens to him, to people living on the street because they can't afford to live in the city anymore, to Lissa, whose daughter gets into a bad situation just because of the way things are in her neighborhood. I think place can affect you in different ways. In Small Animals, it was just the endless rain in this runt of a town in the Pacific Northwest rainforest, and how that does things to people as well. So place is important.
Yeah, place is really, really important. Yeah, and you kind of capture it so beautifully in the novel. And like for people who have lived in Portland, it's a fun way to see your city in a different way. And for people who haven't, it's actually like the cheaper than a plane ticket. Like pick up Ordinary Bear and like go visit Portland, and you'll get like a really exciting, fun tour that you definitely wouldn't have gotten on your own as a tourist. So yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really tried to paint Portland clearly and accurately, but very much I love that city, and I miss it all the time.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, when that nostalgia gets too big, you can just pick up your your own personal copy of Ordinary Bears. Must readers, please also get a copy of Ordinary Bear by C.B. Bernard. And C.B. Bernard, thank you. Thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today. Thank you for writing Ordinary Bear and Small Animals Caught in Traps for us fiction lovers. And for those of you who read nonfiction, also remind me the title of your first book.
Chasing Alaska, a portrait of the last frontier then and now.
Ah, amazing. So many good books. Well, thank you. Thank you for talking to me. Thank you for writing. And thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Erin, thank you. I hope I didn't just give you long-winded answers to all your questions. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to you about this, and it's such a gift to readers and writers that you do this podcast. Thank you so much.
It's truly my pleasure. And long-winded answers are my favorite kind. The best kind is when they're like answers in novels. I can't wait for the next must-read fiction interview that ultimately turns into the next novel. So fingers and toes crossed.
Erin, I hope that when the day comes that your novel is out, you'll let me guest host so I can interview you for this podcast.
Oh my gosh, I would love that. That sounds fantastic. I will keep you posted.
Excellent.
Awesome. Well, many thanks. And yeah, must readers, please check out Ordinary Bear by C.B. Bernard.